Welcome back, colleagues. After lunch, I guess most of us have by now settled again after some good discussions during a long first morning exchange and some further discussions amongst each other. It's my pleasure to introduce the next session of today's workshop here with regard to strategic goal number 3. My name is Michael Berntgen from Product Development Scientific Support here at the agency. Now, the focus of this session here is on patient access and the necessary partnerships with healthcare systems. And in this session, we're going to recognize that the introduction of medicinal products into healthcare systems requires sequential decision-making and the need for engagement across decision makers. And we had many references already in the morning in the various sessions, in the various debates about this need for engagement. It was mentioned in the context of the various actions, it was mentioned by the panelists, but also by the contributions from the floor. So this is really a topic which goes across. And as Hans-Georg was saying in the introductory session, this work should also help us to prioritize external collaboration to strategically advance regulatory science. And this particular bit is now what we really would like to focus on in this session number 4. This session number 4 is in its structure very similar to the previous one. There will be an introductory presentation of the core recommendations together with the various actions that have emerged from the various input that Hans-Georg presented earlier, and how we came to these strategic goals and actions. And then we are going to have a panel discussion, or panel contributions, I should say, from 7 panelists representing different groups, different stakeholder groups in this context. And of course, the input of various stakeholders is crucial, even more so in this session, because by the very nature of this discussion now, the goals and the activities that we are outlining today need to be reciprocated by other stakeholders. They need to be worked out in collaboration. So it's very important to listen and hear the different perspectives. And of course, as also said before, there will later be ample opportunities to further engage and to contribute to the various actions as we propose them. So let me try to structure the discussion in 3 different buckets, I would say. Let's cause it around an area of cooperation, so where there's certain need for cooperation. Let's focus it around evidence, the evidence that's required, and let's focus it around communication. And these are the 3 different areas that you're going to see here on the slide. And I believe all of the stakeholders here in the room, but also those connected via the broadcast, can relate to these areas today. What we have discussed in the previous meeting, or in the previous sessions, was always there is, of course, an interdependency of all these actions. They could have gone in one or the other bucket. There's a certain perspective you're going to take on these ones. So what I'm going to present to you now in the next 17 minutes or so is not all completely new topic areas, but maybe with a different angle, with a different facet, and why they need to be worked out in the context of cross-decision maker, cross-stakeholder engagement. And that's really the focus I would like to take now. And that's the particular thread we would like to follow. So let me briefly review the various actions under each of the core recommendation, which really aims to demonstrate EMA's willingness and commitment to engage in these in the context of this launch exercise today. Let's start with this strategic goal, which recognizes that the introduction of therapeutic innovation into the healthcare systems requires this sequential decision-making, and cooperation amongst decision makers is necessary to smoothen such decision-making, with ultimately the aim to avoid a delay in access or even, worst-case situation, no access. And we have heard in previous references what this could also mean from a patient perspective. The starting point for this discussion is evidence. Evidence as the basis for each decision-making, and it's crucial to ensure that the evidence that's generated on a medicine or on a technology ultimately is relevant for all decision-makers. To this end, the EMA has been cooperating with HTAs, for example, since 2010 in a number of areas, including the generation of evidence needs. Furthermore, there is the need to exchange regulatory information that can then support production of outcomes in subsequent decision-making, like relative effectiveness assessment. And Said Frias, in the previous presentation, has already referred to the communication about the benefit-risk assessment to HTAs and also payers. But then it's also about learnings from these different steps of decision-making, of assessment, and to allow feeding back into evidence generation plans. So really develop a cycle of knowledge and ultimately come to a concept of evidence by design, because that's really what, as a catchphrase, could allow to stimulate that discussion in this context. And again, here, Giovanni Tafuri in the previous intervention was raising that there are some challenges also for HTAs in this space. And finally, a third area is to know of what's coming into the healthcare systems is extremely important for preparedness. It's extremely important to facilitate introduction of innovation in order to allow resources to be set, expertise to be generated, processes to be in place, etc., etc. And everything which we then refer to under the umbrella like horizon scanning is therefore extremely important to be carried out also together with other stakeholders. And again, various references were made throughout the day. So in this context, you can see here 5 different actions that we propose in terms of cooperation with HTAs to cover these principles, to cover these ideas. Moving from here, it's of course to support further patient access. We also need to ensure that relevant evidence and information is available to payers who are ultimately responsible for their budgetary considerations. And we had a first discussion with EMA with the payer community back in 2017. I think what's very important here in this discussion is to acknowledge that this community, the payer community, covers organizations with different scopes and also different working methodologies. And yet, what we have identified through this discussion back in 2017 is there is common ground for cooperation with some or all of these organizations. And that's really what we like to focus on. Again, preparedness of the healthcare system depends on knowing what's coming in, and therefore elements like horizon scanning are of high interest. Also, for some decision-making by payers, it's very important to ensure that required evidence is produced. Evidence in terms of scientific or clinical evidence is being produced, like in the context of new pricing models, like in the context of conditional reimbursement, which is explored in some areas, where post-licensing evidence generation is extremely important. And again, milestones need to be set in advance, expected outcomes need to be discussed in advance in order to facilitate these discussions and these principles to be explored further. And then, of course, there is a need to get clarity on the outcome of regulatory decision-making, like what's covered in the label in terms of subpopulations, and what were the evidence considerations here. And of course, this also includes the concept of unmet medical need, which has been applied in different ways by different decision makers. So against all these background, you find here 4 actions for engaging with the payer community as a starting point for this reflection, which we're going to put forward at this point in time. Now let's move to the second bucket. The second bucket was about evidence. And the first strategic goal I would like to put to you here is the reinforcement of patient relevance when it comes to evidence generation. What's meant here is that the introduction of innovation into healthcare systems, and that's broadly speaking on purpose, requires evidence that shows patient-relevant benefits. And with the opportunity that patient-reported outcomes can report on disease state or treatment impact from a patient perspective independent on a third-party interpretation, we should also recognize that historically this has been of very limited use from a regulatory perspective, to the exception of some areas like pain, for example, where PROs have been used. However, the use of PROs in development is growing. We see more and more scientific advice in this space, but also, importantly, it's been used in the decision-making chain by other decision makers, and that needs to be recognized here. And therefore, the drive towards value or outcome-based healthcare is certainly a stimulus for further PRO use. Against this background, we can also say that development of e-health monitoring tools, as we discussed them earlier today already, will certainly also stimulate development of respective information. But it also, as said before, it requires properly designed PROs that can really weigh into the assessment, can give reassurance and evidence that can be used in decision making, and therefore it's very important to have upfront discussion on such tools. And I can give you the example of in COPD, for example, for proactive, where there has been a lot of discussion through qualification of what could actually a PRO really mean in terms of decision making. And I think that's very important, including, and back to the theme, the collaboration with different stakeholders. And again, it was mentioned this morning how important it is in this space to discuss with various stakeholders on the design of these PROs, so they give the reassurance of the evidence that we need for later decision making. So addressing all these challenges around patient-relevant evidence generation is what is captured in these three actions, which you can see here on this slide. If we move further from patient-reported outcomes into a topic which we had discussed a lot today already, to real-world data or real-world evidence, then of course, we've said it this morning, there is a widening perspective of the use in decision-making. And what do we need as decision-maker? We need access to data or output of data, and there can be various models that lead to aggregated data and results. And secondly, we need an ability to analyze these data and really embrace what we can learn from these data. For this, we need to establish the right platforms, the right frameworks, as been described here, and this discussion needs to progress. It's an ongoing discussion, and keywords you're hearing in this context include direct data access, include common protocols, include common data models. Some of these words we also heard before in previous session. And of course, a very relevant example from day-to-day practice is registry information, which again has been started to be used in various forms to then also better inform decision-making. All of these concepts are different with regard to their assumptions, with regard to the speed they can answer certain questions, and with regard to the costs involved. So again, this is why the discussion is quite tricky. And yet, it requires, again, stakeholder engagement, stakeholder discussion across decision makers. And as an example, I give you here the Cystic Fibrosis Registry, which has received a qualification jointly discussed by regulators in HTAS. So for the first time, both decision makers have worked on contributing to the qualification of one particular registry, but also different stakeholders and what they need. So really beyond decision makers, and Mark Hope was making this comment earlier in his intervention. We need to recognize there's various initiatives in this space and various work that's going on, and this includes particularly the work around e-health data. And to put this all together, we have some actions here which we put forward with a call for a sustainable, quality-assured, flexible framework in order to then also allow capacity and capability building to analyze and interpret real-world data, but also to ensure that the learnings are embedded in regulatory decision-making. If this is real-world data, then we can go even wider and we come to big data, of course. And again, what would be such an overview without at least mentioning big data here in this context? It was also referred to in previous discussion. And this engagement becomes a very important focus. We need to put data together. This was a quote from a previous discussion, putting data together and the various sources here. And again, we have a new data landscape, which is enormously rich, but it is invalidated and unstructured data in many ways, and it emerges in very large populations. So whilst it promises a holistic view of patient experience, for example, in health and disease, and again, this is an important point which was raised previously, we need to see that it can actually add value to decision-making, to benefit risk decision-making and other decision-making. And therefore, we need to allow for deeper understanding of these data and to see how they are presented and utilized in the regulatory context and beyond. And again, as said before, this is really where multi-stakeholder engagement with other decision-makers in healthcare systems is crucially important. You've heard also before already quoted by colleagues about the EMA-HMA task force and the report which is coming out in this space. This is about evidence in terms of various areas where we need to collaborate in order to move forward and get regulatory science stimulated. Let's go to the third bucket. The third bucket was about communication. And let me start here by using a reference to something which many of you know, and yet this needs to be modernized, which is the product information. The product information in itself is the key regulatory output, allowing to guide a safe and effective use of the medicine. And yet the way we're using product information today is anarchic. And I think this has been widely recognized, not only by a recent EC report, that there is a need to improve how information on medicines is conveyed to both patients and to healthcare professionals. There are various elements that we need to achieve through an electronic product information, or EPI. There's an increased access needed for patients through, for example, digital tools. There is a need for better use of the information through enhanced structure and better interactivity. And of course, the example here is when it comes to interactions, so that healthcare providers get the information they really need. There's a need to have automated and faster updates of product information. And of course, tailored provision of information is something which is ultimately a goal. I should say one thing right from the outset here. What we're talking about here is the statutory information. It's the statutory information which is held by the regulators on the medicine. It's not about promotional information. And I think that's a very important distinction to be made in this space. We need to agree on a technical format to do so. We need to ensure commitment in order to agree on common standards. And therefore, we are going to have a workshop in November where we define the principles for such standards. And that's a very important step, again, moving forward. And the output of this work will then also later go to a public consultation and will ultimately be put forward to the medicines regulatory network also for adoption. So it really has to be quite encompassing what is going to be discussed in this space. What you see here are the various actions which are exactly in the scope of what I was pitching to you with regard to the planned work on the electronic product information. Now, very important and very specific focus, you could say, is the next one to come. And this is about the work on biosimilars. The concept of biosimilars in itself has been driven by Europe. I think that we can dare to say. And also, Europe has the highest number of biosimilar medicines approved globally so far. However, we should also acknowledge that there are challenges with regard to the uptake in healthcare systems and that the need to further improve confidence in biosimilars, as well as to get abreast with the advances in science and technology here. Engagement is therefore key to foster acceptability, and communication campaigns have already started. At the same time, the regulatory framework needs continuous adaptation, and technically there are advances in terms of utility, for example, of the non-clinical data and the better use of critical quality attributes in the discussion, as well as new methodologies which require then openness in the regulatory science to make these new science advances useful in regulatory decision-making. The actions proposed here cover these elements of communication, training, and technical advances in regulatory science in order to progress this topic further. And last but not least, let's move again to a bigger picture, communication in a wider sense to promote trust and confidence in the European regulatory system. Again, here we need to acknowledge that the scientific delivery of regulators has to be underpinned by high-quality information and communication. And therefore, it is very critical that information coming from the regulatory system, coming from EMA, is very critical to functioning as regulator with the purpose of ensuring transparency, with the purpose of information of healthcare professionals and patients, as well as other decision makers, of the scientific outcome of the EMA work, as a key tool to promote trust and confidence in regulatory decision-making, and to facilitate dissemination in scientific, to disseminate scientific information through various tools. This put all together requires a strategy which brings all these elements under one basket, and therefore also the discussion we are having here today with regard to the regulatory science strategy is extremely important to stimulate into and to feed into this overall strategy on communication. This concludes the review of the various strategic recommendations that we have identified under this goal. Again, just as a reminder, we were going through different buckets. We were going through the areas of cooperation and collaboration with HTAs and payers. We were going through the areas of evidence in terms of patient relevance, in terms of real-world data and big data, and in terms of communication through the electronic product information, the biosimilars, as well as external communication in a wider sense. With this, I would like to conclude this primary introduction of these strategic goals and would like to hand over to our 7 panelists. So it's quite a large number, but this already again indicates to you that there's a need to engage with a large group of people in this particular space to ensure access and uptake in healthcare systems. And the first colleague I would like to invite here for presenting a view, a perspective, and also to give some guidance on potential priorities from what you've just heard here is François Hoyer from Eurodis. François, over to you.
Thank you, Michael, and good afternoon. Well, thank you for the list of recommendations. I'd like to make nine comments. And maybe the first comment would be on the governance. Hans-Georg Eichler mentioned the need for more social research in the role of different actors in how medicines are regulated. And I think it is important to remind that the decision-making in this agency relies on deliberative democracy, where authentic deliberations are key to the decision-making, and which makes the legitimacy of the decision. And we have to continue work on this line particularly regarding patient involvement, patient engagement throughout the healthcare system, where nowadays patients are more and more engaged in the governance of centers of expertise in rare diseases, for example, or European reference networks. Some patient organizations are even consulted by industry for the go-no-go decision. They look at the data together and they discuss, should we continue, should we stop, should we continue with this diseases, but maybe stop there. Patients are engaged in the regulatory process more and more. Patients are more and more involved in HTA assessments, and we hope that with the future HTA cooperation, this will also be the reality. And UNETA is testing different modalities to involve patients in the scoping of HTA technologies, the assessment or early dialogues, and we hope that this will continue at all steps. Everywhere decisions are made that affect our life. I would say that I think it should always start by the evaluation guidelines. There are many diseases for which evaluation guidelines exist, and maybe they need to be completely revisited with all the new possibilities, the new potentials. And there are many other guidelines, diseases for which no guidelines exist. And the EMA cannot initiate the reflection on all diseases, on all guidelines that are needed. HTA also are invited to participate in this guidelines development, but we think that taking the example of some diseases, particularly spinal muscular atrophy or Duchenne, who initiated together with clinicians, industry, a reflection on how to evaluate medicines for these diseases. And this should also be even facilitated by the European reference networks, which gather all the expertise around these diseases, initiate the reflection and propose to regulators when they feel it's mature enough to adopt these guidelines, even if in most cases it's true that by the time the guidelines are adopted, they're already outdated, but at least the exercise is important because it shows the direction, it shows where to go. And the guidelines are also important for PROs, but with a different meaning to the R, the patient-relevant outcomes. And I think it is important, as you said, Michael, to invite patients in all discussions where decisions are made, such as which outcomes should we use. We should not let others decide for us what is relevant to us. And I'm saying it maybe a bit too strong, but this is because we've seen recently amendments proposed to the HTA regulation, which said clearly patient-relevant outcomes are only about mortality and clinical endpoints. This is not exactly the case. Surrogate markers, for example, which could shorten the duration of clinical trials, are extremely relevant to patients as well. And we need more discussions, more reflections on what should be in the development of medicines, discussing with HTA regulators and industry which one exists and which one can be taken on board. We also need better or new tools to monitor the real-life impact of medicines, but there is a balance. How much evidence do we need prior to the marketing authorization, and how much evidence can we continue to obtain after the marketing authorization? There is a shift. It's not the same budget. It's not the same decision makers. And I think I'd like to mention this domain of value of information. That's the amount a decision maker would be willing to pay for information prior to making a decision. I think it's important because we can live with some uncertainty, but uncertainty has a cost. We can generate evidence to lower this uncertainty, but this evidence generation also has a cost. Prior to the marketing authorization, it's the developer who pays the cost. Before or after the marketing authorization is somebody else. ultimately it's all of us, but somebody else, different structures. If it's data generated by healthcare medical records or registries, then you need to put in place all these infrastructures. So it's more than the public sector, which is in a way funding the additional research. About economic information, I think, and this is also about acquiring new skills, I think it could be interesting if EMA would have in-house expertise in pharmacoeconomics and economics of medicines. There are legal reasons for that. The economic criteria is one of the possible criteria to obtain orphan drug designation. And also Article 8.2, which relates to products which obtained orphan drug designation. When member states think they are sufficiently profitable, they could request an opinion to the EMA to see if it is justified to maintain the market exclusivity. To provide this opinion to member states, we have excellent experts in the Committee of Orphan Medicinal Products, but maybe what is lacking is expertise on the cost and economic aspects of medicines, and maybe also to engage the dialogue with payers. Maybe it could be interesting if EMA would have more expertise in this field. 3 last points. On the same line, maybe the EMA should have a much larger budget to fund or mandate research. Research that are needed, for example, when the CHMP would like academics to investigate or to ask questions to those running registries or databases. Well, you need some workforce to do this analysis. And the way it works currently is usually that there is a question from EMA, and then the owner of the registries turn to industry to see if they would be willing to fund the research. And then there are questions, okay, so your analysis was not independent because funded by industry. Why couldn't EMA, and the EMA already does it, there are some pharmacovigilance studies which are funded by EMA. I think it could be extremely useful if EMA, like FDA, would have its own research budget to also explore, for example, of all the pictograms that are proposed in the package leaflet, which ones are understood by patients, which ones are effective, which ones serve the purpose, etc., etc. Regarding and finishing with the involvement of patients, so now there is a classic model for EU regulators where 1, 2, 3, 4 patients are invited to meetings, to scientific advice, or to CHMP oral explanations, or to scientific advisory groups. Other methods exist: focus groups, citizens jury, expert panels, interviews. We have a long list of maybe 20 different techniques. Maybe some of them bring more information than others. I think we should continue to explore all the possibilities, all the contributions of these various techniques involving patients. Regarding the communication and the need to explain to the public how things are decided, how decisions are made, how really democratic and deliberative are the decisions, there is also a role for patient organizations involved in EMA activities to explain to their peers how this is done, because there is still too much ignorance in the public on how medicines are regulated. And a note also on community advisory boards that Simone mentioned, which are a platform where the same patients give advice to different regulators for their own diseases, which initiate the discussion, the scientific dialogue early, sometimes even before the development starts. And we think this community advisory board should learn how to exchange views, information with regulators and HTA, because they are also a form of deliberative democracy where they confront the data provided by industry and other sources, and they make their own collective opinion on the technologies they work with. And I think I will stop here with my main remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, François, for these reflections, and I think they fit very nicely also in this scope. I could see that you were going around certain areas like the active involvement of patients in various ways. You were talking about the evidence that needs to be looked at more as a continuum, and I think that's something which is recognized more and more, the life cycle approach to evidence generation, that there is not a barrier at some point, and it's really something which, again, evidence by design needs to be prospectively planned, and there are different reasons which you also now referred to, but then also very critically stimulating R&D that can also be facilitated through such work. So really appreciate it, including also, and again, this is when I said in the beginning, it's so important that this is reciprocated, what we are doing and what we are intending to do, that you were also saying, here's also some work that needs to be done by us as a community around the communication, for example. And again, this is hugely important because it really brings together how this whole scene looks like. So very much appreciated. Thank you very much. With this, I would like to hand over to Niklas Hedberg from TLV, the Swedish HTA organization, but today in his role as chair of the executive board of UNETA. Niklas, over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to EMA for inviting all of us to this seminar. I think it's both brave and very generous to have such a big meeting on initially internal matter where we can contribute. And this morning, Giovanni Taufiri also contributed from UNETA, but I'm here as chair of the executive board. Thank you. I'd like to start with reminding ourselves and telling those that do not know that we are already doing a lot of things together. And I think that the companionship with upstream and downstream partners and stakeholders will be a theme that is very important. And for this purpose, I'd like to inform and encourage the continuation of a very successful cooperation on early information sharing and exchange of information between EMA and UNETA, where I know also, for example, that patients have been involved in discussions in our joint assessment work. We also have a very far-going and reaching cooperation on early dialogues or scientific advices. It's different names depending on which house you go to, but we work very well together there. And we have also started working on more intangible things like unmet medical need and so on. So I think there's a really good start. And having looked into your three buckets, Michael, engagement, evidence, and communication, I think with the engagement back to the upstream and downstream, and the beautiful picture of the River Po was one of the first we saw today and is one of the most important, I think. We must do whatever we can to increase understanding and preparedness, because very few of us can make successful decisions without linking and understanding what's happening, what has happened before us and what will be happening after us, so to say. And I must also disagree with something I heard today, which I know could be interpreted as, if the patient don't get access to a medicine that is approved, then HTAS has done something wrong. That is not our opinion. HTA is a very broad discipline and can be done in many different ways, but ultimately someone will have to make a downstream decision or recommendation or action after HTA. And if we still remember that there is something like affordability and budget constraints, I think when HTAs do a perfect job, that can mean we also deliver an early negative response to patient's needs, for example, as long as it's early and transparent and objective. So that was a comment from earlier today. But having said that, we must enable early, equitable and affordable access. That's a core duty for all the agencies around, I think. And the last thing on engagement is that we must really keep on working on the real-world data track. I was here a couple of years ago when talked about real-world data, and then half of the room refused to use the term. So a lot of things have happened in quite a short period of time. That's going to be tremendously important. And that brings me into bucket number 2, the evidence. Because when we do realize that real-world data will be all around us and will be needed for us to help patients and system to access drugs, we must also realize that one of the first steps is we need to look into the methods and find agreements on the acceptable methods, the validation that you talked so much about. We need access to high-quality data. And access is not only that data need to be there, but they will also need to be there for the purposes that we might have, even though we are different and have different aims. On the evidence side, I'd say that it's a very interesting task that you suggest on your slides for UNETA and EMA together to work on health-related quality of life, patient-reported or, François, patient-relative outcomes. That's going to be very interesting. Going into the third point of communication, that's really where we have started most of the work, but also tying back to what's most important for us in the HTA community these days is the proposal from the European Commission. Whatever happens, I would say, if it's going to be mandatory or totally voluntary or so, we will see more of common assessments on the European HTA level. And to do that, we need earlier information exchange, and even earlier than today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Niklas. Thank you, very, very clear. And again, very nice to hear also the reflection where, can I also say, based on the good experience over the past years, what we have started in terms of cooperating, where we need to continue this path and collaborating, yes, on product-specific engagement, but also in the context of methodologies, in the context of using data differently. You were making some references to RWD as well as the PROs, and to see that there is a willingness to engage. I think it's important for everybody to hear in this space, because this is what I said in the beginning, what this strategic goal is all about. Fantastic. Can I move on then and ask Gonzalo Calvo to present a view from a healthcare professional perspective? Many of you will know Gonzalo, and he's now active in the Healthcare Professional Working Party, particularly, but also working as a clinician. So really, from that perspective, to have your perspective, to hear what you are thinking about these proposals, but also how would you prioritize would be extremely interesting. So over to you.
Thank you, Michael. Well, I agree with Niklas in saying thank you for the invitation. And I hope that after my intervention, you don't regret for having invited me. No, you have right on many of very important issues. Some of them I will not insist on because, for instance, François has very well explained what is the growing role that from patients are expected in not only the regulatory decisions, but also at the level of the HTA decisions, and the work is going on. I will put some emphasis on two specifics. One that I don't think is problematic, because I think that we will be in the process of understanding the role of real-world data. As I mentioned this morning, I think that we are still far from applying the big data in terms of regulatory and HTA decisions making level. We need some more efforts in terms from the industry side and from the academia in order to validate the real applicability of that. But the real-world data is much more than that. There are even pragmatic clinical trials using electronic health records that are very useful for making active comparator trials. This has been extensively used in the cardiovascular field, for instance, and there are a lot of publications in this sense. And I think that companies should be prepared to provide this almost at the time of the regulatory approval, and be absolutely ready to provide at the time of HTA assessment, because Otherwise, I fully understand HTAs. One thing is that you prove the effect or the efficacy and the reasonable safety, but otherwise is how do you position the drug in the market as compared to the others. And I think that companies still have to learn. They are starting to provide some kind of data that are usable by the HTAs, but I think that companies need to work a little bit further in this regard. And now I'm going to be provocative, and sorry, Nicholas. Yes, I think that today that there are many instances questioning the European Union. I think that what there is no question is that the European regulatory system has been a real success in the European Union. And the whole idea of the EMA and the network of national agencies was to harmonize the decisions, to speed up the access of patients to really important drugs, and try to get an harmonized pharmaceutical market in Europe. And I think this is a real success. I mean, there are many things to criticize in the European Union, but not the regulatory system. Of course, some criticism may be always present, but overall, analyzed in perspective, I think that this is a major achievement of Europe. And this is despite the initial and for some years resistance from national competent authorities, because there was the feeling, and I was representing one of these national competent authorities, that creating the European network was a way of giving up the responsibilities at the national level, because everything, someone in Europe was going to take the decision on behalf of you. What we realize is that it is not giving up the responsibility, it's sharing the responsibility for taking the decisions at a much bigger level, that is Europe. When you understand that, you realize that the networking system is worth to be created. What's my feeling? That what we made, or that the European Commission made at the level of the regulatory body, we are disharmonizing at the level of HTAs in a way that the access, the real access for valuable medicines in Europe is not harmonized, is again different in different countries, and not only in different countries. In my country, there are 17 regions, and depending on which regions are you living in, even if two villages are separated by 5 kilometers, but in different regions, you may have access to important drugs or not. This is not acceptable, and this is simply a way of losing the credibility of the health system. And the same I said this morning, and I repeat now, that science should be ahead of political and regulatory decisions because it needs validation. There are some situations where political decisions should be ahead of science and the society. And I think that a common HTA approach in Europe is urgently needed. And in this regard, the European Commission should take a role, should adopt a responsibility, and the national agencies and the national bodies dealing with health technologies assessment and appraisal should learn in a way that this will not mean all the HTA disappears, but just networking in a real, not at the level of creating guidelines, not at the level of putting in common their experiences, but at the level of taking decisions. Taking decisions at least on the utility of the drug, on what is the added value, on what is clearly proven in terms of what benefit provides this drug as compared to the others. I understand that afterward the pricing is something more complex, is something to do with the budget, with the national richness and so on. And there may be many ways of dealing with these differences. But at least to make sure that the assessment of the efficiency and usability of a drug is common for Europe. Otherwise, and I can tell you from the healthcare professionals now, not from my regulatory perspective, Physicians do not understand why a drug is usable in France and not in Germany, and maybe in half of the population in Spain. This is not Europe. This is not the right way to take decisions. And nothing more. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, Gonzalo, for this perspective, as you're saying, from a healthcare professional, what you see in day-to-day practice, because it's really important also to bring these topics, of course, into the open. They're not part of this regulatory science strategy due to remit, but of course they are in many people's mind in their discussion, so it's important to also have them voiced here in this context. And therefore really, really important. The other point around evidence, of course, with electronic healthcare records, what I would just add is it's, of course, one thing to deliver data, but then also you need to know what to do with the data and to also have the tools, capability to really exploit the data completely. So this is, in this context, I would really like to see then also these, or suggest these discussions to occur. Fantastic. Thank you very much. Can I move over to colleagues from industry? First, we have Fosca de Iorio from UCOPE, therefore presenting small and medium-sized enterprises here particularly, and certainly a very specific aspect on this introduction of innovation into healthcare system. I'm looking forward to your considerations. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, and thank you for giving us the opportunity to present. I'm Fosca de Iorio. I'm presenting on behalf of UCOPE. So I suppose the first thing I want to say is that really the agency recommendation capture what are key priorities in the area of rare disease in particular. A lot of things have been said, and I think I'm going to repeat some of the points, but really what I feel I need to do is to highlight what is important for a rare disease perspective. So I suppose the first point I want to make is obviously in orphan disease, for the nature of the disease itself, the evidence that we are requested to provide for a regulatory approval provides a wide range of challenges in terms of value assessment. So I think Giovanni Tafuri was mentioning some of the aspects that are often criticized. For example, the limited number of individuals for which we have trials, use of open label designs for clinical trials. And again, the lack of a comparator or the choice of the comparators is again another shortcoming sometimes for assessment of value in orphan disease, and also the measurement of short-term surrogate endpoints that might need to predict outcomes in maybe over a lifetime. So I suppose my question to the agency is what is the role that the agency can play in bridging this gap between the evidence required for regulatory and value submissions. Related to this, also I want to echo what Gonzalo has said, and I think everybody is agreeing on. There is disparity in access to treatments across Europe. And this is because obviously value assessment approaches to orphan drugs especially are really different in the different countries. And as a result, there is really a high degree of pricing and access risk for orphan drugs. So Simone showed this morning the results of the survey in orphan diseases, where 24% of patients didn't receive treatment because it wasn't available in their area, maybe not just related to access challenge, versus 7% in the general population. So for a patients, a clinicians, and a pharmaceutical perspective, because we are all in terrible agreement here, there is really a need for a more consistent approach to policies between regulators and payers. So again, I would like really to understand what the agency consider its role in providing and facilitating this alignment. Always on evidence, I suppose. Rare diseases are often genetic conditions. So what can happen is that we can have a large variety of genotypes in the same population, sort of some population. So because of the nature of this, we won't have clinical data for all the patients, available for all the patients. So my question to the agency is, can I have your perspective on how we can approach this? And then I suppose if we can overcome the regulatory hurdle, then how can we translate this? How can we make the case to payers and HTA for access to this medication for patients that could potentially benefit from those? And then moving on to real-world evidence that is really connected, I do believe that, we heard this morning, development is becoming a continuum, and real-world evidence is really important for orphan drug. We really welcome initiatives like the qualification of the European Registry of Cystic Fibrosis. But real-world evidence is not, and access to registry is not just important for post-approval studies, it's really important for all for the life cycle of the drug, so from establishing the burden of illness to obviously continue to establish efficacy and safety of the drug to effectiveness. So again, my question to the agency would be, what would be your role in working with the registry to make sure that the industry can become an active partner with the registry, that the registry are resourced enough to provide the data in a timely way and the quality standards that we do require. And finally, my last comment is, you pointed out that it's really important the early interaction, the involvement of all the different stakeholders. And as an industry, I believe we do have these interactions, but we have these interactions in not a consistent way, in separate ways. So the framework sometimes is complex, it's difficult to navigate, and it's difficult to get everybody in the room and agreeing. And so, again, how can we overcome this? How can the agency facilitate this interaction and provide advice on the way to best engage? So thank you for your time. I think I made my 5 minutes. So thanks again.
Thanks a lot, Fosca. Very, very clear and really to the heart of the matter about evidence generation from various perspectives on the orphans, on the real-world database use, on the registry database use. And you posed several questions to the agency, and I think this is really what's part of the discussion we are having. So thanks a lot. Can I then move over to Beata Stepniewska to bring a perspective from Medicines for Europe, certainly also on access. Just a quick reminder, we're running a bit short of time, so if the remaining panelists really keep their contributions very focused, so we can also allow some more questions at the end from the floor, that would be great. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Michael. And first of all, thank you very much for inviting Medicines for Europe to this important panel focused on patients' access to medicines. And obviously, I would like to talk today about the particular point, access to biological treatment. We all know that biological treatment can really make a significant difference and huge progress in treating some diseases. However, it can only work if the patient has really an access to this treatment. And we all know about quite big inequity in access to biologic medicines in lower income countries, but even in higher income countries like Germany or UK, only 10 to 14% of patients with rheumatoid arthritis receive really treatment with biologic medicines. So I think that from this point of view, arrival of biosimilars medicines can deliver really better access and more affordable treatment for more and more patients. So although we are talking about the decade of experience with biosimilar medicines used in the clinical practice, there still needs a lot needs to be done really to unlock the whole potential in sense of improving access. So the question is, what can we deliver better by 2025, and how can the regulatory science contribute to this better outcome in 2025? I think that I would like to pick up on 3 priorities, looking obviously on the role of EMA and regulators in this context. I think the first one is looking at the role of EMA and regulators in bridging evaluation, authorization to access and helping to remove some barriers in access. The second one is in fact to look at the EMA communication on all scientific approaches, which somehow leads to the third priority, which is to drive consensus and convergence in optimal trust in the regulatory framework. Let me develop very shortly those 3 priorities. The first one, the role of EMA in bridging evaluation authorization to access. I think we all really recognize the great value and extremely important role of EMA and competent authorities in assessment authorization of medicines. But in fact, this marketing authorization is just the initial step of the life of the product. And in fact, this the second part, the rest of the path of the access is equally important. And I think that from this point of view, the regulators and also EMA can do more in sense of increasing communication, increasing this uptake, obviously without interfering with the national systems, national payers, but in sense of the communication and building trust. That's a really fantastic role for the regulators. And I think that EMA has extremely privileged position, having those working groups, having those interaction with patients, healthcare professionals that could really be used as an excellent channel more to spread information, to spread knowledge, and somehow, as I said, to contribute to the trust. It leads me to the second priority, indeed, about EMA communication on all those scientific approaches. As Michael said in his introductory speech, Europe was really a pioneer in setting up the regulatory and scientific standards and framework for biosimilars worldwide. And I think that the European regulators have gained so much knowledge on biosimilars by assessing so many applications that it can be really somehow capitalized on in those communication and educational activities. Because in fact, despite the decade of experience with biosimilar medicines, and as we say, almost 7 million of patients' day treatment in Europe only, the principles of biosimilars remain still quite poorly understood in the healthcare system. And this is where we really would like to see the role of the regulators to step up and somehow defend the science behind their decisions. So it leads me to some very concrete recommendations or the points which I would like to emphasize in view of future EMA communication. First of all, I think what we need to understand the concept of biosimilars is to start with the understanding and communication on the nature of biologic medicines in general. Without understanding of the nature of these products by healthcare professional patients, we will never be successful in understanding the concept of biosimilars. The second point is to communicate on experience and advances in regulatory science. EU regulators are really the best place to talk about constant scientific and technological advances, which creates evolution in overall thinking about the regulatory standards, about the regulatory requirements. this consolidated experience which you gain through scientific advice, through assessment of the applications, led already to the evolution of the guidelines, evolution of the regulatory framework, new way of looking at the requirements, what is really needed to develop biosimilar medicines, what is really needed, what is necessary, what is scientifically justified to develop biosimilar medicines and approve them without unnecessary patient exposure to clinical studies when it's not scientifically justified. So if we could have a good communication from the authorities, from the regulators, what it means, for example, what really matters for biological medicines to when it comes to the assessment of efficacy and safety. When can we, when it's necessary to extrapolate indication, and when we can, based on the scientific knowledge, and when we can really, based on the scientific knowledge, approve the indication only based on this extrapolation principle. Also, when the clinical comparability is necessary and when we can really waive those kind of studies because they will not bring any new scientific knowledge. And also, last but not least, to explain why analytical comparability is, in fact, the sharpest and the most informative tool to characterize biosimilar medicine. So I think this, it's challenging already scientifically, but now the real challenge is how to translate this knowledge into the language which is understood by health professionals or patients even. So that's the real challenge, and I think the big task for the regulators. Another point which I would like briefly mention is
Beata, sorry, I hate to interrupt you, but we're really running out of time. Sorry.
Okay. Well, just very quickly, the last one is to think, the conclusion only. Also to look for the future in sense of follow-on biological and biosimilar products for small population. I think that the regulatory framework for the moment is not ready to get those products on the market in the future and to be developed. So somehow regulatory science has to look at this and come with the proposal. Otherwise, we will not have follow-on products and more affordable for this kind of smaller populations or orphans. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much for these reflections, particularly in the biosimilar space. And I think it's well pitched towards also the strategic recommendation which we have put forward. If I can then move over to Christine Meyer-Nicolai from FPIA for reflection from the, can I say, innovator's perspective. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Michael, for the opportunity. I'll try to be quick, but I need to come back to some aspect that was mentioned only lightly, I would say, and that's the patient voice. The EMA has been pioneering the inclusion of the patient voice for many years, and we can only congratulate the European system for that. But now I think it's time to align on how we can have the patients provide input into regulatory decision making. And we really need a framework for how to factor in patient preferences. And this should be ideally agreed on a global basis. This is needed for patient preferences not only on the relevance and prevalence of clinical outcomes, but as well on benefits and risks preferences for patients. And it's absolutely great that EMA is supporting the IMI Prefer project, which is working on methodologies in this area. But we cannot wait for the outcome. The patient perspectives should be supported and accepted as evidence during medicine's development and evaluation by regulators and HTA bodies. And it's not only about PROs, if I may say so. PROs are very important, but what we are discussing here is about a systematic consideration of meaningful patient experience data. I think, François, you were alluding to that briefly. And this should be done along a spectrum of direct consultation, involvement, partnership and shared leadership with patients, but also it should include assessment of documented research in dossiers. And it should also include communication back to other patients in the label, finally. So it's vital that EMA propose and advance a framework which can ensure the inclusion of patient perspectives in clinical outcome assessment. And such a framework should ideally translate into the application of value frameworks so that the time and effort that patients put into the development of products are really then leading to better and faster access in an ideal space. So I said we cannot wait. Why is that? As we all know, the FDA is mandated by regulation, by law, and that's the PDUFA 6 law, to publish so-called patient-focused drug development guidelines, one a year, and they have already published 2, so 2 more to come. Their framework will stimulate research in this area. And it's already an ongoing discussion on a global basis, a scientific discussion on these methodologies. And we can only really plea that the EMA involves itself and the European network involves itself in the discussion so that we hopefully come to an aligned approach on these methodologies, how to evaluate and capture patient experience, but also how this information will then be interpreted by agencies and other bodies. So it would be great to have an aligned approach which would enable rapid development and appropriate flexible guidance on how to capture patient experience in clinical research. And it would also help then provide certainty for industry, but also patient organizations who would like to do such research, that it will be accepted ideally globally. And it could then be implemented or reflected in ICH guidances, GCP, E6, E8, and other international guidances. So real-world data was mentioned several times, and I can only underline what was said. It is very important that we come to a place where the conditions required for acceptance of this data, also in the pre-approval setting and the post-approval efficacy space, are clear. And this should be then also pertaining to HTA and payers. So what is acceptable for them in the ideal world? It's great to see that the EMA intends to focus on the use of new data sources, such as patient surveys and data collected by digital technologies, wearables, etc., and how this data can provide evidence to support the approval of new products. It will be very important, again, to have a clear regulatory framework to foster further research and investment in this area. So as you were also mentioning several existing networks and Hans-Georg Eichler this morning, we are sure the EMA will build on these networks as NCEP or IMI Protect. And we hope EMA will further leverage industry and academic experience on real-world data to really create this, as you were saying in one of your slides, Michael, sustainable, quality-assured, flexible framework which delivers rapid access to and analysis of representative longitudinal real-world data throughout the life cycle of a medicine. I think this was very well said, although long. I wrote it down. I liked it. And of course, the e-patient information or patient label, electronic, we can only support what you were saying. It's very important to have real-time information that is accurate, that is easily accessible and understandable for the patients, and to fully realize the potential of the digital technology. We need to have European structures and harmonized data structures. So as you know, industry, and this is not only FPR but also Medicines for Europe and ASGP, are fully supporting the activities and will participate in the workshop that you mentioned end of November. And finally, because it was mentioned by several panelists, the HTA regulation is definitely an opportunity to contribute to greater alignment in Europe on clinical evidence generation requirements, and has the potential to expedite access for patients. And FPR, as you will not be surprised, is supporting that the equivalent step in national assessment process will be mandatory. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Christine, for this perspective, and also the highlighting the patient's voice and the patient preferences, particularly in this context, also given the global perspective. So really, really useful as an additional element here. Last but not least, a perspective from the payers, and I'm glad we're having here Arts Schuurman from the Dutch payer organization, ZIN, but also as a chair of MEDEF here today to give a payer's perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much. In your presentation, you already gave clear signs on what EMA wants to do with payers now and in coming years, so I'm quite happy with that. So organizing and join early dialogues with multi-stakeholder, with all aspects around the table, like we do in MOCA now. Help us with our horizon scanning, because we need that for our work. You have the information. You have a lot of information, so please share in a workable way. The indication and labeling to make it more precise, make the subgroups more clearer, for who does it work, for who maybe, for who not. Very important for us. So we're quite happy with these plans. If we look the last 10, 20 years, EMA succeeded to serve the needs of industry. There's a good collaboration. You speak more or less the same language. You have the same paradigm, which is good because it's your job to do so. And you started to do something like that with HTA and with patients, which is really good to explore. I hope we will succeed from payer side and regulator side to go into that same area. Maybe you need some assistance from the Commission on that. I don't know exactly where the borders are, but we are talking about 2025. In the Netherlands, we have 90 hospitals. Today, 4 broke down for financial reason. I'm not going to say it's only because of expensive medicines, but it's one of the reasons. So we cannot wait until 2025 to find workable solutions, and EMA can help us in our decision-making process. So as an enabler to facilitate this with the knowledge and the procedures and the capacity you have. So we are very happy with that if it succeeds. One last, it must be quick. The concept of adaptive approaches was first here 2012. 1 month ago we had the first real pilot with all stakeholders around the table on an adaptive. So that's 6 years, and that's, I'm afraid, too long for what's coming up in healthcare now. The technology is rapidly moving now, so we have to be in shape to handle that. So it's a serious problem. I don't know exactly how to solve it, but speed is getting more and more important. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Art, for a very precise and very speedy contribution here. Really appreciate it. I think you really nicely highlighted the constraints and the strains on the healthcare systems with the example you just gave. At the same time, the need for timely reactions. We are actually already beyond the time for this particular session. We were meant to start the next session at 3 o'clock. I believe the panelists have a very broad spectrum of different perspectives being presented today, which I think gave a lot of food for thought. I would suggest, in the interest of time, because we have 2 additional very heavy sessions, I would call, to not take additional questions at this point, but to move over to the next session. I would like to thank everybody who was contributing to this particular part. and hand over to Marco Cavalieri for session number 5. But I think we should also recognize the contribution from everybody with the usual way of giving them some applause. Thank you.